Okay, well, it's 3:30, so I think we should make a start. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vassou, a professional trustee at Dariada Trustees Limited, and welcome to our Tea with a Trustee session today. Being tea with a trustee, I do have my cup of tea, which is very nice. And with it being the Christmas session, I've also been sent a mince pie, which is very nice as well. So today, we're going to be talking about investment topics, and in particular, all the new legislation and regulatory requirements that we as trustees have been asked to comply with, particularly over the last year or two. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about that, but also about the experiences that we've had in trying to comply with those requirements and the work that we've done and, working with our advisors to deliver those requirements. We've got until 4 o'clock this afternoon. When the invitations went out, we asked for questions to be submitted, and a number of questions have already been submitted. So we'll be covering those during the course of this discussion. So thank you for that. But we do have the chat box and the Q&A box where you can submit questions during this discussion. Alongside me today, I've got my colleague David Fogarty, who's going to be taking us through much of his thoughts on this and our experience around these topics. David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Vassos, and good afternoon, everyone. And hopefully you have your cups of tea. I have mine as well as Vassos. Hopefully I'll get a good number of questions as we move through the next half an hour, giving me a chance to have the odd sip as we go. I'm also an accredited professional trustee, but my tenure is a bit shorter than Vassos, having only joined Dariada in June of this year. Prior to that, I spent about 30 years at Mercer. The latter part of that very much on the investment consulting side, and therefore I've drawn the not so short straw. It's a pleasure to be here to talk a bit about investment regulations and the challenges that we as trustees are facing with the myriad of regulations that have hit us in the last little while. So I'm going to break it down into a few two segments so that hopefully we can get some questions between them. The place I'd probably start with is kind of policy. And I think, we as trustees, and I think lots of other trustees have, reacted to regulation and added policy in the area of, ESG and voting, etc., dutifully over the last number of years. And now I think what we're beginning to witness is a bit of a change where, if you go back in time, SIPs were very much a sort of a matter of record, and they didn't really find their way out of the cupboard that often. But with the regulation, and particularly with the requirements of implementation statements, there's a need to talk about what your policies actually are. And now that we're through that sort of first wave of implementation statements, we as trustees are beginning to see some challenges from auditors. So if I give you a couple of reference points here from an auditor, which I think is quite interesting. So we have a SIP. It says a trustee will monitor financial material considerations, blah, 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 blah. And the auditor asks, any monitoring during the year? So the auditor is wanting to know what monitoring has actually taken place. Similarly, we have a comment in a SIP which says the trustees will review the investment manager's voting policies with the help of its investment consultant and decide blah, blah, blah. And the auditor wishes to know, did any review happen during the year? And then the third example is where we're saying that the trustee takes into account the FRC's, stewardship code, etc. And the auditor is inquiring as to whether compliance was checked. Did we actually tick that box off when we made a decision? So I think what we're doing is we're entering a different era now, where you can't just make policy and put it away. You actually have to, set process alongside policy. And I think that's a challenge for trustees, because it's going to require, us and other trustees to spend more time on these issues. More time, more money, but it's the case that once you set a policy, you really need to be thinking through, well, what does that really mean for activity, and when are we going to do it, and how are we going to plan for it, and how are we going to make sure it's done and evidenced.
Just on that, David, in terms of the advisors that we work with and the whole sort of advisory community and managers, I suppose, as well, I think we're gonna need their help to get us to a position where we can actually demonstrate to auditors and to our members ultimately that we are actually doing what we say we're going to do. Have we seen any of that coming through yet from other parties in terms of how much support we can get from them?
I don't think we're starting to see that yet, but I think what this is going to do probably is it's going to shake the tree a little bit in terms of trustees, us included, will need to go back, and whereas we I think you could argue that whether it's an investment consultancy putting forward policies, or whether it's a trustee firm, that there tends to be a fairly homogeneous set of policies across a client base, and actually I think that's going to break down, because if you're a much smaller pension fund with a much smaller governance budget, you actually need to set policies consistent with that governance budget. And if that then requires you to then, engage with your consultant in a different way and ensure that the funds that you choose automatically comply with all the requirements that you think are sensible, then you go down that route. So I think that I think we'll see some change here. Hopefully there'll be a good degree of change from the fund management community as well, in that many of the things that we require as trustees, which are kind of hard to put your finger on at the moment, actually should be more routine, and they should be actually provided more easily in reporting.
Yeah, I think the point about smaller schemes is interesting, because my experience so far has been with big schemes and small schemes. The SIPs that have been drafted and signed off are very similar from one scheme to the other, regardless of the situation that scheme is in, and regardless of the size or governance budget that scheme has. So it will be interesting to see how different schemes tackle that particular requirement given their own circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because I think what you'll find is that the cost involved in complying with the governance isn't if the policy is the same, the cost will broadly be the same. So that then takes you down the line of, if you're a £50 million scheme versus a £500 million scheme, you're either going to bear the same costs or you need to have different policies. And I think what we'll see is a push towards different policies at different parts of the market. It's a useful link as well, probably, to the next area that I might touch upon. And if we get more questions, obviously Vassos will chip in as they come through, and that's implementation statements themselves. So the first implementation statement started to appear early in October. Actually, there were some in September, where some very dutiful trustees were including them before they were, obliged to be, within the accounts. And what are we actually seeing there? And what are the challenges for us as a trustee firm, and what we suspect are the challenges for other trustees? I think kind of the biggest challenge is kind of paucity of data. And you could argue that's twofold. There's two parts to that. One is planning to get the data. So was enough thought put in advance about what the requirements were, what we needed, when we needed it by, and who was going to provide it? And then secondly, even when that planning has taken place, is the manager able to provide the data? So I've seen a real sort of variety of situations. Somewhere basically there's no data available, and the implementation statement is fairly empty, but interestingly, from an auditing point of view and from the regulations point of view, actually compliant, because the requirement is on you to seek this data rather than necessarily have the data, which is a bit strange. Right through to the other end, where schemes, because of the particular managers and funds they've invested in, have been able to get hold of fund level voting and engagement information for the funds that they held, which is, you know, what the requirements are. There is a fairer body of implementation statements in the middle, which are sort of, you know, purporting to be what is required, but aren't actually quite what is required, because they're actually commenting on the voting of a fund manager as opposed to the particular fund within which you're invested in. And that's led to, I think, a lot of conversations among, you know, regulators and you know, DWP and TPR about how to kind of, you know, square that circle. And I think that's largely why Guy Upperman set up this task force to help with voting and engagement reporting for pool funds, which are the group where there seem to be the biggest issues. So
in our role, David, then as trustee, you know, we've said what we've said in our SIPs. We want to show that we are following what we said we were going to do in our SIPs. And then we hit this problem where there's no data to prove things one way or the other, whether or not we have been doing what we said we're going to do. So in my position, I'm going to turn to my investment consultant and say, you know, get me the data. You know, I want the data. I need the data. And they're going to go to the investment manager, and the investment manager is probably going to say, not interested. I haven't got the data. Da, da, da. How do we square that circle? Because, you know, I'm going to be sitting there potentially blaming my investment consultant for not delivering something that I need, and they themselves are not going to be able to actually deliver it either, because they haven't got the information from the investment managers that they need.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I don't think it really properly changes until regulation requires fund managers to provide certain information, you know, routinely. And at the moment, they're not required to provide that to their customer, in this case, obviously the pension fund or the trustees on behalf of the pension fund. I think there's lots that can be done by us and by investment consultants in between as well, in that, you know, at the point in which you're reviewing a manager, you know, there'll often be a conversation about, you know, ESG principles. There'll be potentially some commentary from an investment consultant about which products might fit with the principles that the trustees are talking about, and still relatively at a high level. And there tends to be this sort of general industry acceptance that because the manager can't follow your policies, you will follow the manager's policy. But in essence, you've bought into that because they've told you what it is. And then the missing bit, which is missing today, which needs not to be missing in the future, is if the manager sits in front of us as a trust board or any other trust board and says, well, this is what the fund is, and this is how it's organized, and this is how we behave in all these areas, you know, the question's got to be, well, demonstrate it. You know, you need to demonstrate that to me in your reporting. So, you know, as well as seeing your quarterly performance report, I want to actually see, you know, a sheet in there which shows all the things you voted on in that period, any specific stakeholder engagement you've had, shareholder engagement. I need to see the reporting, and it needs to be routinely there. It shouldn't be something that I have to sort of drag out of you kind of kicking and screaming.
Yeah, and in my experience of sort of being part of selection exercises for investment managers, you know, they'll come along, they'll tell you how brilliant they are. They'll usually tell you they're the best, they've got the best team and the most experience, and so on and so on. And it's sometimes very difficult to separate them just based on what they present between them. And so having that sort of data, that sort of information could be something that tips it one way or the other, I would have thought, because at the end of the day, as trustees, we need it to do our job. And so I would have thought that we ourselves as trustees could start influencing that going forward as well.
Yeah, I think trustees have a big big influence here. I think there are many that feel that regulation will actually be required, though, because until the influence of trustees arguably would be pervasive, so it would happen over time. So if we and other trustees started to only hire managers or choose funds which met certain requirements, then the market would quickly figure out that actually we need to change our horses, as it were. But actually, I think probably that takes too long, and actually you need more regulation on the fund management industry, and I think these things are affecting what wider society. It's kind of like how the oil and gas industry kind of probably paid lip service to climate change for a decade or more, and now it realizes that if it doesn't actually up its game, it actually sees its share price going down, it sees its credit ratings falling, it sees its kind of future prospects. I think the same is going to happen with the fund management industry, and that if you're running multi-billion of assets, and you have 3 people working on ESG who are in some office to the side doing some sort of engagement, that's just not going to cut it. It needs to be in the same way as we as trustees are being required to integrate these things into our policies and not have them on the outside. Fund management firms will need to integrate them into their operations.
Yeah, and we should be asking questions about that. I think at selection exercises, definitely.
Absolutely. And I think the last maybe point on that, which ties to that, is that the implementation statements, if any of you have been through or helped clients through them, they are tough. They're just so difficult to actually get over the line. But in a way, getting the implementation statement into the report and accounts is the start of the task. It's not the end of the task. The next task is then to actually reflect upon what the implementation statement is telling you, where the gaps are, how satisfied or not you are with the actual what the manager's been doing on our behalf or on the trustee's behalf, and then to take action to think about whether you need to change things. And I think there's that continuous review cycle that's actually going to make change happen in the industry.
There's just a question on that, David, around whether we therefore think that there's a danger that trustees will end up spending more and more time and therefore money trying to satisfy all these requirements, and whether that's end up being a good spend of money.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable that trustees will need to spend more time on investment. I think the level of regulation in this area has just gone through the roof in a relatively short period of time, and you could argue that the regulation happens because there's a body of opinion that says that there's a significant amount of assets, something of the order of 1.5 trillion in the UK that isn't really focused on these issues, and actually needs to be. And we as a trustee firm, when we think of these issues, we don't think just about the regulation. We think about the fact that we believe that ESG factors will have an influence on outcomes. So if we don't actually pay attention to them, we will get suboptimal outcomes. And I think trustees need to embrace the governance challenge with that in mind. This isn't, although boxes required to be ticked, this isn't a tick boxing exercise. This is actually about taking proper control of the asset strategy and making sure it's resilient to a range of risks that are out there in front of us and that are not necessarily being sort of governed in the way they might be, and now regulations forcing us to apply that governance. So I guess it will come down. I guess the tricky thing, Vassos, with your question is not the amount of money that needs to be spent, but the extraction of value for that money. So how do you make sure that we as a trust board and other trust boards get value for the spend? And that means that you certainly have to make it not tick box, because if you just are ticking off, well, we have this, we've done this, we've done that, and the cost is X, then you've probably got no value for that spend. But if you embrace the issue and say, well, we need to actually only hire managers to do this, this, and this, report in this, this, and this way, well, now you're starting to influence the outcomes and you're more likely to get more value for money.
Yeah, and there's a link there, I think, as well to what we were saying earlier about maybe big schemes and small schemes and how much they can actually spend on all of this in the first place.
Yeah, and there's probably links as well to sort of sectoral changes with the industry and consolidation, potentially at the very small end. The amounts of money that you have to spend just don't make sense, and they drive people in that sort of consolidation direction. So the third, if there are no other questions on implementation statements, I might, Vassos, time flies, but we better move on and talk a little bit about the CMA. It would be kind of rude not to, because over the course of this week, next week, and the week after, I think, a lot of schemes, thousands and thousands, will have to submit their CMA compliance statements. And what started like a fairly routine requirement, not least because the CMA set out some template wording, actually has proved a little bit difficult in terms of trying to decide which schemes it applied to, and which parts it was necessary to certify compliance with. Hopefully schemes have sorted through that now, and that's probably, though, just a thin edge of the wedge, if you like. So trustees have two impending challenges now, quite apart from statements. Probably the most pressing is meeting the fiduciary management requirements. So there'll be a 10th of June next year is a date by which a significant number of FM appointments need to be turned from a, if you like, a non-compliant status to a compliant status. And talking to various people in the industry, we're yet to see that wave kind of come through. So everybody knows it's there, potentially over 500 FM reviews to be done, but to date, not a significant percentage of those reviews have been done. And they will not necessarily be easy. I think, we as trustees, we have various kind of skills and resources internally, as other trustees will have, but you're probably going to have to turn to an outside agency who's got, good understanding of the FM market to do a proper review. And the proper review is not just something that needs to be considered in the context of things like TPR guidelines, but moreover, the fact that if you have to satisfy this 10 June 21 deadline, it means that you put that FM appointment in place sometime before June 2016 on a non-compliant basis, i.e. not fully competitively tendered. And because the market has developed significantly since that time, there's a big price opportunity here. So the likelihood is that, I don't know what the number is, and it will vary by asset size and it will vary by asset strategy, but you could be talking about savings of 10 to 25% on fiduciary management fees if your fiduciary manager hasn't already offered you some of that discount up front. So that's the big kind of carrot for trustees to approach this in an appropriate way. Not necessarily the regulation, more the opportunity to get a better service at a cheaper cost.
And one of the things that I've heard with this in the wider market, I guess, is the idea that some fiduciary manager reviews will be more light touch than others, and others will be a bit more, like you've described, a bit more detailed and full. I mean, have you got any thoughts on that? I mean, is that sort of light touch approach something that can be used?
Yeah, those exact words, I think, have been used in quite a lot of places. And it's difficult. It's sort of like there's quite a lot of detailed guidance from TPR what you should do. And as I said, I think there's an opportunity to save money here. I think the challenge in the industry more broadly is when you get probably, certainly below 20 million, where you mightn't find that there's anyone interested in your business. So actually running a competitive tender for a £20 million DB scheme is actually very difficult. So apart from that sort of situation, certainly we would be countenancing the idea that a proper review needs to be done, some scoping of the market, choosing providers that are consistent with the investment philosophy that you're behind. Potentially you could argue that some of the FM providers are more suited towards simpler, more passive sort of strategies, and some of them are suited to more complex esoteric strategies. Some have flavors of derivatives in there, etc. So there are different fiduciary managers that play to different strategies, but once you sort of filter the market a bit from that, I think there is value to be had from going out to the 3 or 4 fiduciary managers and actually doing the process properly.
Okay, thank you. In terms of other questions here, we've got a question about how smaller schemes in the portfolio are overcoming the challenges of complying with new implementation statement requirements. I think touched upon some of the key points there. And then the other one here is about asset managers and how they're preparing for greater disclosure, which I think you've sort of touched on as well. We've got a few minutes left.
Yeah, I probably had one last thing, and if the question can't stop me, but in the absence of a question, yes. The other point to cover off on the CMA, which I think is quite important, is investment objectives. So again, we as trustees will have put in a series of investment objectives across our portfolio, and hopefully other trustees have done the same. And that was kind of a little bit of a strange sort of exercise, in the sense that it was the first time we were doing it, and not unlike Vassou's comment earlier, we probably had broadly consistent objectives across most of our clients. I think it's 1 year on, although it's not a requirement to actually review the objectives, it has to be considered best practice, and we will certainly be doing it across our clients. And then what we have to do is we have to consider, the things that we said we wanted from our investment consultant, actually on reflection, were they the things that they've been providing us? Are they then providing us other things? Do we want to change their objectives in some way to make them more consistent with what we now see as our challenges as trustees? So I think that will lead to a little bit of a dispersion in the marketplace, where some more folk, where you'll start to see emerging quite different investment objectives for different circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm just conscious of time. We've got a couple of minutes left. I think there's we have somebody with a hand up, but I'm not sure what the question is. With just any sort of final comments from you, David, before we wrap up?
I guess it's slightly covered in one of the questions that you asked earlier, but I think it's undeniable that more time is going to have to be spent on investment going forward. Probably means more fees, which is arguably good for advisors. But from a trustee side, I think the need would be to make sure that we extract value for money for the time that's being spent. And that probably means we start to become a bit more challenging of investment consultants in terms of what they put in front of us, and that it's consistent with what we're trying to achieve. And then also with fund management groups, that when they commit to us that they're going to do certain things, that we are able to see the evidence of that on an ongoing basis.
Okay, well, David, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much. It's 4 o'clock, everybody. Thank you all for attending this afternoon's tea with the trustee. all that really remains for me to do is to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And thank you very much for attending today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.